We're here to talk a little bit about some synthesis techniques that we have implemented in a recent version of Bitwig. Look, I have an academic background. My name is Dave. I have an academic background, so let me be honest. The reason we're using Bitwig is because it supports these techniques, and yes, I also work there. So this is a good place to show it, because there's not a lot of other good platforms to show some of these things in such a visual way. That being said, these are general techniques. These are concepts. These are ideas. This isn't necessarily specific to one piece of software. A lot of these topics were dabbled with years ago in early digital stuff. And that's where the inspiration for us to implement them came from. So as much as I'd be happy to sell you something, I'm talking about ideas today. So just to get a sense of you all, I mean, how many people are like strictly hardware analog kind of people? Do you feel that way? A little bit? Okay. How many people are strictly digital plug-in software kind of people? A few? How many are both? Yeah. Do you want to be both? Do you have to be both? It's a little, I mean, it's all as good as the tools are. So as long as it works, then that's great. And half the time we're just trying to find a way to make the things that we like work together. And that's not always easy. So it's getting easier. That's why there's a bunch of people showing stuff out there. But what I'm trying to lead you through today is we're going to talk just a little bit about classic subtractive from the modular standpoint, not because it's a whole bunch of groundbreaking, not that it's a huge place that you're going to learn a lot, but if we put a couple pointers there, as we start to look at these digital techniques, we can look at them side by side better. And along that path, yes, I will integrate this with, do a short thing of integrating this into Bitwig so that we can control both from the same sources. And then we'll focus on these techniques which we're talking about, which are basically phase distortion and phase modulation or frequency modulation. Call it what you want. To the user, it's kind of the same thing. To the developer, it's a very different thing, but the same concepts apply. Just a fundamental understanding of those two things give you a lot of mileage with a different way of making sounds. So starting from the analog standpoint, and by the way, if you have a question or you want to yell something, that's acceptable. That's fine. It's always a little bit easier if we're talking back and forth, so feel free. Are people happy with the temperature of the room? Good, because I can't do anything about it. But we can deal with everything else. So this probably looks familiar to some of you, and ideally, so we're starting with this little box here. That should sound familiar. Yes, we are simply looking at the humble sawtooth to begin with. The whole point here is the terms that we tend to use in any type of synthesis and any type of sound design. I mean, it's the same if you're working in film, is it ends up being frequency, timbre, and loudness, right? Those are the three descriptors. Well, pitch, timbre, and loudness are the descriptors. The measurable equivalents, frequency, spectrum, amplitude. So it breaks down in a nice, easy way over here in this world, as we know, because what we're getting right now, there is a single oscillator, which is going into a single filter, which is going into a single amplifier. That's where we are. So why is it nice and easy to distinguish these things and have the visual here? Because we'll be looking at the same thing on the digital side. Well, the oscillator tends to represent the pitch side of the domain, or the frequency side of the domain. So as we move that around, okay, the oscillator tends to be that side. Now, why do I say tends to? And just to look at something briefly, because we'll come back to a similar idea when it gets to the phase modulation side. If instead of a sawtooth, which, as is probably familiar to pretty much everyone, basically cascading, all harmonics are present at cascading intervals, saying the first harmonic is there 100%, the second harmonic is there 50%, a third, a fourth, a fifth. So all the harmonics that are possible in the acoustic series are represented here. This is why in subtractive this tends to be the starting point, which means you go towards filters next. Digital was a completely different thing when it first started. So modeling filters in digital was not the easy thing. So they started by changing the wave shape to begin with. Okay, we've got pitch there. pitch coming out of the oscillator. Now also the wave shape does a lot to deal with timbre. So if we switch over to a square wave for a second, or a pulse wave, and as we change the pulse width, we get this cascade of different harmonics being present in different amounts. Now, the only reason I wanted to pull this up for 1 second is this actually relates to FM in a certain way, or a phase modulation. Because the thing that's easy to forget on the math academic side of this is when you get close to a square wave, it means so close to 50% duty cycle, 50% up, 50% down. What you get is every other harmonic. You get odd harmonics. The first harmonic is there, the third harmonic, the fifth harmonic. And again, the same power ratio that we're used to. Oh, the third one is 1/3, 33%. The fifth is 1/5, 20%. Now, what's interesting? Well, that's interesting. Well, as any good music presentation starts, I will start by taking my amphetamine. Okay, so now we'll not go to sleep again. So the interesting thing here, which is easy to forget when you're busy making music instead of analyzing it, is when you come from 50%, what actually happens at the different pulse widths, as we get closer to each interval, so we start there, we're about 50%, everything is about level. Now if we get to a point where we're starting to make half of the harmonics disappear, you notice where we're getting down to that point, and we're just not perfect on that, but we're getting the digital jitter. So there's our 50%, where now we're seeing every other harmonic is present because the second, the fourth, the sixth, those are all coming down to nothing. What's interesting, the reason 50% does this is 50% is 1/2. So what that 1/2 is telling you is every second harmonic is missing. That's the rule of thumb for how to think about it. If you go ahead and start adjusting the pulse width now, and we start finding the next place where a regular harmonic is missing, let's skip to that one. Yeah, it's all ratios basically. So if you get to 66% or 33%, now that simplifies to 1/3, depending on which side you're looking at it, which means every third harmonic is missing. Which is kind of a funny structure. I have the first, the second, the fourth, the fifth, the seventh, the eighth. So the fact that pulse width actually allows some of these things is interesting, and there's a relative idea that comes back in FM. So there, okay. These are all interspersed, and partly this is what makes pulse width modulation, which we're not talking about today, so interesting, is that as you move, it's not just, oh, this harmonic, then this harmonic, it's the different fractions that are happening. Right now I'm at about 1/3. So now it's every third harmonic is dropping out or significantly lowering. And that's where if you start slowly adjusting that pulse width, especially for the analog folks, that creates something very interesting and nice. So there's something about harmonic ratios, a lot of that's going to be coming back. So yes, wave shape helps determine our timbre, but the primary function of oscillator in this case, and we've gone back to sawtooth, is to adjust the pitch. Now, if I move my hand over to the filter, yes, our traditional happy low-pass filter. To start rounding off the shape. So the traditional analogy given here that's pretty useful, and let's scale it up so we can see it a little bit better, is with subtractive we're basically doing sculpture. We're basically starting with a big piece of marble, and then we use filters to chisel it down and create a more select sound. So in this case, a wave shape where all or many harmonics are present, or just a harmonically rich wave shape. And then from there, the filter is doing the work, which tends to be the center of subtractive. So now we're deciding how much of that signal is actually there. So a little bit interestingly, by starting with something rich and then being able to chisel it down, whether we're using resonance or whatever, and we'll look at that in a second, this is just a way of, we're going from something big and shaping it into something small. The digital techniques are the opposite, which is what makes them handy and complementary in a nice way. So if I were to turn up resonance, or just the feedback around the cutoff. Now, one interesting thing here when we think about resonance is if you notice the waveform here, because we know what this is sonically, but just thinking about it for a second with the oscilloscope, as the resonance gets increased, it's that little bump or that feedback amount around the cutoff frequency that's getting emphasized. And while we don't always see it here and think about it in these terms, what's happening is kind of a higher harmonic or a formant of this wave shape is being emphasized and actually coming through. So it still sounds like it's the same original frequency, but you have these extra wave shapes being drawn into the signal. Phase distortion is a little unique in that it offers a way to do that, or at least the way that we've implemented it. Okay. So, timbre. We had pitch on the oscillator, we had timbre on the filter, and then the funnest, most hey, loudness, yay. Coincidentally, why do we do them in this order? Well, pitch is the easiest for us to talk about because we hear pitch changes the most subtly. If you're ever trying to introduce some kind of control source, manipulate pitch on an oscillator first because you will hear it most clearly and you can hear the shape of it. Timbre is hard for our ears to hear. Loudness we're a little bit better at, but we hear so many small adjustments that it's hard to say, oh, now it's louder, now it's softer. It's a very small window of just noticeable difference. So, pitch, timbre, loudness, each in these three, oh boy. But it keeps making sound, it keeps droning the whole time. That's kind of sad. Let's not continue that way. So just so we can compare as we go further, I'm gonna go ahead and take a moment here and integrate this thing to Bitwig over here. I have an ES8 interface from Expert Sleepers. It's got all these quarter-inch outputs, including the glowiness of when it is receiving signal or not, which is very nice. So what we can actually do with this hardware CV instrument in Bitwig that's native to Bitwig is say, okay, I'm actually going to use one of these outputs on the device. I can patch it out and say, okay, this is actually going to send my pitch messages so that I can use the keyboard or notes or whatever I'm doing. And you can see there's already signal being sent out here. And to have it control the pitch input of the oscillator. It's wonderfully in tune, right? C major scale, everybody. Unless you're at a circus, that will probably not pass for a C major scale. So nicely, something that's built in here, and something that's patched up already that makes all this work. Out of that oscillator, I'm taking a separate waveform, the triangle wave, just feeding it into the interface in the first place. Because this entire panel, which will let me adjust and try to tune it. I mean, I could sit here all day and do tuning. Or I could say, hey, I'm lazy. I would like the software, now that it can hear an input, to send a series of pitches out to the oscillator, listen to the input, and please do the tuning for me. Now later, if I accidentally nudge some of the frequency knobs, make some other adjustments, I can run that 6-second process again and be set up. So whatever notes are going out, however I might have changed the rig, it's actually the software doing the tuning itself, so you don't have to do so much fudging on the hardware side. That's one thing to make life nice and easy. Now the second, it's still droning. That's sad. So what we could do is go ahead and, let's say, output 2, and just in a very simple way, use it as the input to the amplifier. So this is going to be our control source. I'm not driving an envelope right now. I just wanted to say yes, on, or off. hey, it happens to be output 2. Even if I don't have it connected, I should see, you see that the port itself lighting up telling me we are sending signal. That is not the sound of the amplifier. It's okay. And now, fortunately, all the nice things of the modern world can be used together. So now I've got the software phase force synthesizer, which is where we're going to go in a second to start talking about phase distortion, phase modulation. One rack, everything being plugged together. Maybe I really like my analog particularly to say, hey, why don't we just... So that just leads us to a nicer place in terms of getting everything in the same box, simple, easy to take around, easy to retune, life is easy. And now we can look at these side by side. But maybe we just take one more second on how all this integration is going, because now we're just listening to analog again. If we were to take, let's say, one of these LFOs, and we were to start listening to pitch modulation, oh boy. So again, pitch, timbre, loudness. Simple control source here, just a upward ramp, LFO kind of thing. Affecting our pitch directly. Well, maybe we move it over and have it affect our cutoff directly. See those extra harmonics getting added into the wave shape as we go up and up and up. And yes, we could do the same thing. What am I doing? So, yes, all of those things are possible. Now, yes, we have a control signal in voltage land. Sometimes it would be nice to take this and be able to apply the exact same signal into our digital side as well. So again, this interface over here, it's not just spitting control voltages out. We could take it to bring them in as well. So you see the value changing over time. And then we could just as easily, for a hardware CV in source, and then immediately we are already seeing the waveform that's living in the analog world. This opens up a whole lot of possibilities. One, if you're really funny, you just turned this interface into a mult. You could now route this to many, many places at once. But at the same point, we could also bring it into the system to manipulate the digital while we're going along. So, with all of that in place, let's take a look at the digital side, and we can go back and forth. Oh, sine wave. So in this transition from analog where digital systems started being used, like I said before, emulating the big, fat, iconic filters of analog systems was not the good thing for early digital hardware. It wasn't high horsepowered, it was not very strong, it was not a way to do good replications. So that led to some inventiveness in the parts of different folks. What a Casio series started doing, and by inventiveness what I'm saying is they're taking the oscillator and turning that into a portion where a lot of interesting things are happening instead of feeding an oscillator and having more downstream add a filter. So in the first example is phase distortion, which started in Casio land. Now, if we just do a brief overview to get a sense, there's essentially 4 oscillator units here going on, handily color-coded to keep track of their waveforms and everything else. So for the time being, you'll notice I'm only listening to Mr. Red. Blue, magenta, yellow, these are all turned off. We're only listening to one piece of audio. Again, we're talking about synthesis techniques. I will not be dropping a beat in here at some point. We just want to talk about tones and how they're shaped. So looking at that makes it a little bit easier. And this color-coded nature also makes it a little bit easier to read this helpful pop-up display. So this expanded device view that exists in phase 4 and in some of the other devices that we've got going on is allowing you to focus in on what's useful and important. In this case, all 4 of those wave shapes are viewed in an oscilloscope view directly along with a component one on the output. On top of that, there are interface controls that tie the software into what you're seeing up there. For the time being, I'm mostly going to focus on the knobs themselves because it's more clear what's going on. So what we've got going on is a clear sine wave. What's interesting about phase distortion synthesis is it's actually saying, okay, what we want to do is read a waveform wrong. Now, what do I mean by that? There's an idea in any of these. Once you've got a table lookup oscillator, or in digital land, an oscillator that has a fixed waveform, it just needs to read through it in a serial way over and over again and interpolate where appropriate. But it's just saying, I just want to play from the beginning to the end, and I have to adjust the time and the speed. It's usually called a phaser or some kind of internal clock that's driving through the oscillator wave shapes. But in the case of phase distortion, as our friends at Casio first envisioned it, by default, this phaser is just reading straight through the waveform. So, oh, this is sine wave output. Okay, we're just reading it as is. Now, what phase distortion lets you do is it starts saying, well, what if we didn't read it in the right way? What if we actually bent the angle or the speed, however you want to think of it, of the read, and then we could kind of dynamically morph the output signal from something that's very low complexity, a sine wave, single harmonic, into something of richer harmonic complexity. So as we started a minute ago with a filter and started bringing the cutoff down, we started with a very broad high harmonic series and reducing it to something smaller. The exact opposite is happening with these digital techniques. We're saying we would like to start with something very basic, and we can focus on red up here. And then, as we gently bend that reed head, it is going closer and closer to a sawtooth, basically. Now, there's a couple interesting things here. You noticed when I was turning the cutoff down, particularly on the signal, or, you know, don't have to trust me, I can hit play. As I'm bringing the cutoff down, you get to this place where everything gets much quieter. There is no signal left. So in terms of a unique starting point, this is going from the place where you always have fundamental. The filter can't move in and accidentally cut this signal out. So it's much more controllable either in a production or a performance because you always have that original tone there, no matter how far down you bring it. And now, the reason that this one here is going from sine to saw is that each of these oscillators has different algorithms for phase distortion. which basically determines the starting point and the end point. If we go back and take a look again at our Casio friends, who were the first people to do this, they had a similar idea. So this is kind of, this is a bit of a note out of their playbook, and then I'll start showing you how we varied on it. What you're actually doing is saying, version 1 morphs from a very simple sine or cosine, which sounds the same to our ears, to a sawtooth, or it morphs to a square, or it morphs to this kind of bumpy triangular short pulse. Or there's even these resonance waveforms. Now, this is why we were looking at the filters. We turned up resonance a minute ago. You actually start hearing formants get emphasized when the resonance gets up. You see those multiple wave cycles added into the original wave shape. That's exactly what they were emulating here, and letting you morph from a sine wave to a place where there were, it was emulating a higher resonance. So, yeah, filters and analog was everything that came before, and this technology wasn't trying to be the same thing, but it was trying to fill in some of those gaps so that it could deal with the arguments of saying, how do we make a sound like this? How do we do that? If you listen to the original digital stuff by itself without much manipulation, it's thin, because it's all starting from sine waves for the most part, or triangle waves, or a couple other dinky things. It's how they get manipulated that turn it into something interesting. So the algorithms that here are in that same tradition of algorithms that Casio had. So it's really mapping out, the saw algorithm says, my starting point is a sine wave, my end point is a sawtooth, and then there's something interesting happening in between. What is the path that it takes? My starting point is a sine wave, and in the end I'm ending up like that pointy pulse wave type thing that was going on. Starting off with half of a wave. Do we want to be fancy? Maybe we do. We still have that LFO coming in from the system over here. So what if we go ahead and use our analog LFO to say, would you please manipulate the shape parameter over time? Why not? So now, why isn't that wave shape changing? Because I'm not playing a note. And yes, I could just as easily take one of the in-the-box modulators. It's a little easier to control. That so that we've got some animation on this as we play. And yes, if you see the 3 nodes going there, it's actually representing the phase of each note that's getting played and showing you where it is in the LFO at the current moment. I don't drive, but that looks like traffic. So now one thing that's interesting here, if anybody has any particular questions or thoughts. Good. So, now a couple functions that are added in here that make this more interesting. One is that there is a literal phase control. Okay, this word phase, we keep using it. What does it mean? Well, it normally means the starting point of an oscillator in particular. In this case, we can even look at the LFO for a second. What's going on? Well, when its phase is set to 0 degrees, every time I start it, it starts at the high point, the beginning of this wave shape. And if I push that, it's letting me start at a different different place in the cycle. Now, the phase conversation gets a lot more interesting in phase modulation in a second, but the fact that this parameter is here actually gives you a lot of control to begin with. So even if I were to temporarily disable that LFO, we're back to static waveforms. Now if I adjust this phase control, in the sine wave mode it looks very plain. It looks like we're just offsetting the wave. But what's actually happening here, and how this has been implemented in Bitwig differently than what the original folks at Casio were doing and other folks who did phase distortion, is it's not just using it as source material, it's actually applying the idea inside the process. It is actually modulating the phase instead of just creating a static waveform. Now, I think it'll make sense. What? That was not a waveform option a minute ago. So the actual process itself is happening inside the waveform and creating something more interesting and unique. So when this was at 0 degrees to begin with, okay, that's an interesting waveform. But now, it's not just something that if you manipulate it over time, before we even start getting to enveloping the signal and deciding the shape of it, this inherently has a different sound. It's got that discontinuity in the wave shape, so it's creating a few more harmonics. And kind of a sharper attack. Now on top of that, that is something that we could modulate, but it's interesting because it wasn't present in the original model that Casio was using. Now on top of that, none of these algorithms are doing the formant thing, the resonance adding thing, because on any of them, this little cryptic number here, this 1, is saying, well, we're on the first harmonic. Let's pretend we were on the second harmonic, or the third harmonic. And now it's using the wrapped portion of the wave shape to actually add that tone into there. So 9, 8 more, it's probably 2 octaves, or 3 octaves. But all of these things are already built into the system as a place to manipulate any of this, which makes it a little bit more interesting and a lot more flexible than what was here to begin with. So as a starting point, it's an interesting way to say I am starting from something very simple, and I'm morphing it into something complex without ever completely cutting off what's at the bottom. Now that's an idea that phase modulation and FM shares. But let's revisit for a second our analog friend. So, if we were to take another output signal here and maybe send it into the cutoff. Now, just as we were bringing a control voltage signal from there into the software, we could go in the opposite direction. So why don't we go ahead and use output 3. And now we can use the software side to do something interesting that's easier over here. Maybe instead of a step sequencer module in the rack, I just want to throw a step sequencer onto here and say, please. Now, one thing that's interesting here, and the reason I pull this up as an example for a minute, not just because we're going between digital and analog again, this itself, if you recognize that symbol, actually has a phase control built onto it. So once we start talking about phase modulation, frequency modulation, are they different things? Do they create the same result? This is actually an interesting place to start. So the fact that this has a phase control here means that we could stop the clock itself and then just tell the thing to go ahead and cycle through its phase. Now, in a very similar way, anything that we start putting in, such as an LFO, is going to start acting like the clock source in this case. A little slower. Now, conversely, what the difference would be, here we're modulating the phase, which just means modulating the current position of the waveform. What we could do instead, hence phase modulation, is target the actual frequency of the, in this case, step sequencer. And sometimes tell it to go faster and sometimes tell it to go slower. Now, when people get hung up on frequency modulation, phase modulation, as a synthesis technique, in the end, they're creating the same effect. It's just the method by which it is being approached. So by adjusting the phase of an actual oscillator and literally saying, oh, now you're here, now you're there, this is back to that digital phasor concept that we were talking about before. So having something like that driving an oscillator does give you more minute control over it. It just needs to be a much smoother output controlling what's going on. So in the end, the general principles between phase modulation, frequency modulation, the rules are pretty much the same for how you control the sounds. And that becomes interesting in its own right. So we can go ahead and start with some of that. Sneaky formant knob will definitely make not a sine wave out of what you were doing. So again, if we start with the basic sine wave in this case, and we start taking, in this case, what's required, phase distortion is nice and clean because you are manipulating the way a single waveform is being read. With frequency modulation, or phase modulation, what you're doing most of the time is taking a second oscillator to modulate the first. Again, we haven't talked about a filter portion yet. So we can create rich harmonic content that does evolve over time before we get to the filter portion. So in this case, you have to relate your first oscillator to another oscillator and say, okay, I would like, in this case, the blue oscillator to create a modulation on my first. So, okay, red, yes, we're listening to blue. How much are we listening overall? And you notice something more unique is happening very quickly. which has a couple different explanations. I mean, what's happening with FM, and it's probably a familiar sound, the FM tones. What's happening here, and let's go ahead and add a little spectrum. Now, remember when we were talking about pulse width earlier, and as you manipulate pulse width, you start losing harmonics, which makes it kind of more interesting. One thing about phase distortion was in those particular models, it was just going directly to adding all harmonics. We were going straight from a sine wave to a sawtooth. Phase modulation, frequency modulation, has a much more interesting effect because you, again, like pulse width, are actually losing things over time. So as we increase the amount that the blue oscillator is coming in and manipulating the red oscillator, and we're looking at spectrum here, you will see the wave shape become more complex. But notice the fundamental frequency is losing power. It almost goes away there at a certain point. So there are really three important controls once we start talking about frequency modulation that we have to be concerned with. The amount of modulation, or the index of modulation, which is the knob we're doing here, which is its total harmonic potential. How broad is the spectrum? Now, and then the other two are pitch settings, but let's keep focusing on the index of modulation for 1 second. Because, well, let's go to his classic text. What this is visually showing you here in the original book by John Chowning, Figuring Out How FM Synthesis Works and Can Be Used, is exactly what we just saw a second ago. We are starting with a very small amount of modulation. It's mostly the fundamental and a little bit of something higher, maybe just noise in the system. And as you increase the index of modulation, the amount of modulation, you get more and more harmonics that become present. So what he's showing you is over time going from no modulation to more, or deeper. It's basically opening the attenuator and saying, let that audio rate signal manipulate the original. Now, probably a very small sidebar worth mentioning. When you do audio rate modulation, meaning something above 20 to 30 hertz, something that actually sounds to us like a tone if we were to listen to it, on any parameter, in this case we're doing it on the frequency, via the phase, but in the end manipulating the frequency. If you do audio rate modulation, you create sidebands. You create additional harmonics in the signal. That is how our ears perceive it. So as this gets turned up, the appearance of more harmonics happens. And this is why there's a lot of modulation techniques to deal with. Whether you're talking about amplitude modulation, pulse width modulation, if it's done at an audio rate. Any of those modulation techniques will create additional harmonics. It's just that in frequency modulation, they become a bit more predictable, which is nice, especially for rock and roll. So, as this gets opened up, and that wave shape gets a little crazy, yes, it doesn't just become a nice, clean sawtooth. Yes, the fundamental is even disappearing. I promise we're not going to do a lot of math. These are the powers that end up coming out from frequency modulation. These are Bessel functions. Some people use them to create bridges. Some people use them to create frequency modulation synthesizers. But this is inherent in what happens when you are doing linear frequency modulation. You see this? This is the fundamental frequency if we're doing two sine waves. This is what happened a minute ago. Full strength on that, no modulate, we don't hear any of the other harmonics. And as you start increasing the index of modulation, as other harmonics get stronger, yes, it does happen in moments where the original goes away completely. which does become something much more dynamic. So if we were just to highlight that one, yes, we see where it disappears. And yes, if we were to go out further, it happens again and again and again. So as the waveform becomes more harmonically rich, as the spectrum widens, it's not evenly distributed. And that feels more organic and more interesting, which is why doing morphing timbres in FM synthesis can be quite interesting. So let's go ahead and we're just focusing on the frequency modulation stuff for a minute, or the phase modulation. So let's go ahead and say yes. So each note individually is getting rich and adjusting over time as we go through it. Now, again, we're just focusing on one because we want to hear it and we want to understand what's going on. If you had 4 of these going on at different rates doing slow things, you could build up something just as quickly as doing multiple notes. It'd be more layered, it'd be more chaotic, or simple if you want it to be.
Maybe you could turn the bipolar sign off so that the LFO moves all the way through of the LFO.
Yes. Turn.
I just wanted to say that you can turn the bipolar thing off, because then the LFO will affect the whole range.
Oh, you mean the bipolar part?
Yeah. Maybe that's.
Yeah, if we're starting here, that makes sense. Thank you. So from looking at this, just the index by itself is a rather rich control, and you can see how putting something like an envelope generator or whatever directly on that index of modulation does give you control to morph your tone over time. Now, what becomes particularly interesting are the other 2 parameters that are involved. And with these other 2 parameters, we've basically covered all of FM. I know in some senses it feels like a dark art because most interfaces with FM, you end up getting a nice big matrix of values, and it's like, okay, how does this happen again? I mean, I have to look them back up to remember how it works. So I think the interface has been simplified a decent amount here. Oh, that much? This, yes, red is being manipulated by blue this much. And yes, if you wanted, oh sure, some by purple, and oh, some by itself. Feedback, why not? That goes a bit out of our predictable control, so we're going to leave that down for a minute. But 1 is the index of modulation. And now the other 2 things are the frequency of the carrier, the oscillator we are hearing, and the frequency of the modulator, the oscillator that in this case we're not listening to, it's just providing the modulation of the first oscillator. If you look in the books, it's going to call it a C to M ratio, the carrier to modulator ratio. And that is why there are nice little ratios that you can set for frequency control in here, which does make a big difference. So it's the ratio of this oscillator to this oscillator. Right now, they're set to exactly the same thing. They are set to a 1-to-1 ratio, which means the wider this gets, we start getting harmonics. We start getting amplitude at every harmonic. All harmonics are being added. It's not a sawtooth necessarily, but what we are seeing is all of those harmonics present in varying amounts. So it's close to a sawtooth in terms of the potential spectrum. Now, the ratio of M, the C to M, the modulator value, determines how far apart all of the harmonics are. Okay? This is why we started with all the harmonic business earlier on. So if I take the modulating oscillator, in this case the blue one, and say, oh, now you are 2. Now, what does 2 mean? Let's just ignore modulation for a second. If we just listen to red, and now we add blue, yeah, it's an octave above. All right, 2 to 1 ratio. That's an octave ratio. So if this is 1 octave above the source it is modulating, now what we get is every second harmonic, every other harmonic. This is starting to look like the pulse wave, the square wave that we were talking about earlier. And it has that hollow clarinet-y sound because they produce the same spectrum. In FM, or in phase modulation, this is the value, this is the harmonics we are adding. So the 2 to 1 ratio every second. Let's toggle it back. 1 to 1 ratio every first. 1 to 2 ratio, carrier to modulator. Every second harmonic is being added. Every third. And if you really want, we can talk about why there's 2 pairs over there, but that's... So, a lot of the early systems that were using FM synthesis, DX models, all that sort of thing, what were they popular for? Electric piano sounds. How do you make an electric piano sound? Well, you put the harmonics far enough apart because you've got the tine of the electric piano, that high frequency that comes in at the beginning. So that tends to be like a 10, 1 to 10 or 1 to 11 ratio. Now, on a Rhodes or a Wurlitzer, you play that note. It doesn't sustain the time forever. So now what we're doing is manipulating the modulation to go down after it starts. Which, yes, we could do. So let's start with it very low. Maybe even a quicker attack. Now we'd need to adjust the amplitude of the wave shape itself because electric pianos don't sustain forever either. But that's the heart of it. So that C to M ratio, the M is not actually changing the pitch of the sound. It's just changing directly the harmonic spectrum that we have. Makes enough sense? Good? Yes? Oh boy. Now here's the fun part, and this is the last major parameter of FM. That C portion of it, C to M ratio. What it's actually changing isn't the pitch. It's the center harmonic that we're creating. What? Okay, so we see the spectrum here for a minute. It still sounds like the original note that we were playing. Now, why does it sound like the original note if you don't necessarily hear the fundamental frequency? Well, just think of it this way. If you pass a vocal through a high-pass filter, you got a vocal going and suddenly you cut off the low end of it. Does it sound like the pitch has changed? No. No, because the way our ear hears pitch is actually the distance between the harmonics. So the distance between the harmonics is not changing. It's like we're high-pass filtering, if we want to use that analogy, the signal. And yes, if we change the modulator, that will start sounding like the frequency is changing, because now the distance between the harmonics is actually changing. So, one fun, easy trick I like with FM, taking all of these things into account. No index of modulation means you only hear the original, the carrier sound. As you increase that, you hear the influence of the modulator. So what's kind of a technique I like, which is a very small example, is to basically fake what pitch we're on at the beginning. So as the wave goes, it suddenly sounds to your ear like, oh wait, we're not on the note that I thought we were. Simple example is exactly this 7-to-1 ratio, right? So again, 1 to 1, this is the actual. Now if we go up 7 to 1, basically like an octave and a flat seventh up. So if I totally remove the index of modulation, now we're just going to hear a sine wave that's tuned off. So a fun way to deal with that is to say, hey, I've got an envelope. Maybe I want it to slowly move and open. And maybe I just want it to say, what's the index of modulation? So now, over time, hopefully that's slow enough, it's going to sound like we're on the wrong pitch, and then it's going to start sounding like, oh wait, now we're on a different note? A little abrupt. Still abrupt. The point is, I know a lot of these techniques seem kind of impenetrable, or we don't think about them a whole lot, but they are very usable if you understand some of the few basic rules that are there. With phase distortion, it's pretty simple. You're just going from one wave shape to another, and then understanding what other parameters you've got. Like if I took this phase parameter and randomized it for each voice I was playing, then you're going to get a very different wave shape, but kind of similar for each note that's occurring. With FM here, just these 3 parameters of saying, all right, we have the index of modulation, which is how wide is our spectrum, and then the C to M ratio, which is the starting point, and how far apart, or the pitch that we're getting out of all of it. If you know that, you could work with a couple sine waves and create something interesting. And then as much as you want to layer on top, yeah, I mean, take notice. Analog, right? Big filter. That's the whole point. We're used to it. We like it. It's a nice thing to use. Hey, look what's on here. Big filter. Did we talk about it at all? No. Are we going to? No. We all need a smoke break, let's be honest. It's here. It's actually, look, I'll even tell you it's interesting. You can manipulate frequency the same way from any of those oscillators at audio rate. Will that create sidebands? Yes. Like I told you, any audio rate modulation of a parameter will create sidebands. This will be a filter that is moving very quickly. Does it create interesting things? Yes. Is that what we're here to talk about? No. We're done with filters. Go away. So, a couple basic techniques, a little bit of the reason why they came out of this world, because they were trying to emulate pieces of this, but they couldn't. And now it's back in software. And look, I mean, it's like the tools, right? If they're all digital, we're talking about software for a second, they all have their own purpose and function. If it works for you, it works. And having strength with some of these things, understanding the parameters and the values, whatever synth you find it in, is going to give you a broader sound palette and something that is a decent alternative that can be mixed and matched with this pretty well. So, that's all I wanted to go through. Thanks for coming by.